What if I told you that a single company could take over an entire nation, poisoning its water supply with cancer-causing substances, destroy its environment and livelihood, and even control its government and military? This isn't a dystopian fiction. It's the story of Shell. First, Shell identified Nigeria as a prime location due to its vast oil reserves and a government susceptible to bribery. They promised to develop the country, create jobs, and bring in foreign investment, all in exchange for control over the oil extraction infrastructure. Shell's strategy was meticulously planned. They began by negotiating deals with the Nigerian government, offering lucrative terms that appeared to benefit the nation. These deals included promises of job creation, infrastructure development, and significant revenue from oil exports. On the surface, it seemed like a win-win situation. However, these deals came with strings attached. Shell ensured that the contracts gave them extensive control over Nigeria's oil production. By 1958, Shell started oil production in Nigeria, marking the beginning of an era where Nigeria's economy would become heavily dependent on oil. This dependency set stage for Shell's dominance. Oil became Nigeria's primary export, making up 95% of its total exports and 40% of its GDP. Shell's influence on the nation's economy was immense, giving them unparalleled power over Nigeria's financial and political landscape. Next, Shell made Nigerian officials dependent on them. They built the infrastructure, but crucially, they owned and operated it. This meant Nigeria couldn't reclaim control without severe economic repercussions. Shell invested heavily in building the oil extraction and distribution infrastructure. This included everything from drilling rigs to pipelines to export terminals and refineries. This ownership created a dependency loop. The Nigerian government found itself unable to manage or operate these facilities independently. Any attempt to nationalize the oil industry or reduce Shell's influence will lead to immediate economic crisis, as the country's revenue were deeply tied to the oil exports controlled by Shell. Shell's dominance over Nigeria's oil infrastructure meant that the Nigerian economy was at the mercy of the corporation. This dependency allowed Shell to dictate terms, ensuring that their operations continued with minimal interference from the government. Shell's grip tightened through corruption. Reports and investigations have shown a consistent pattern of bribery and corrupt dealings, ensuring that Shell maintained access to Nigeria's oil resources. Through a combination of financial incentives and political pressure, Shell managed to secure favorable terms and permissions from key officials. These corrupt practices ensured that Shell's interests were always protected, often at the expense of Nigeria's environmental and social well-being. Corruption became a tool for Shell to navigate the political landscape in Nigeria. By funneling money to key officials, Shell ensured favorable policies and protection from governmental crackdowns on their environmentally damaging practices. These corrupt practices not only secured Shell's operations, but also undermined Nigeria's democracy and governance. The nation's leaders, compromised by bribes, often turned a blind eye to the environmental and human rights abuses occurring under Shell's watch. But Shell's control came at a terrible cost. From 2010, nearly 3,000 oil spills were recorded, releasing at least 29 million liters of oil into the environment.
All the 4 cases were sabotage, so not actually done by Shell, they were actually by criminals who steal products.
This poisoned the water supply with cancer-causing substances and devastated local agriculture and fishing industries. Communities living in the Niger Delta saw the rivers and land contaminated with crude oil. Fishing, a primary source of livelihood, became impossible as fish populations dwindled due to the pollution. Farming was similarly affected, with oil seeping into the soil, rendering it infertile. The environmental destruction also triggered a health crisis. Studies found that the water in the Niger Delta contained high levels of benzene, a known carcinogen. Residents reported increased cases of respiratory issues, cancers, and other serious problems. Entire communities were left impoverished and sick, dependent on Shell for any semblance of economic activity. The promised development never materialized, replaced instead by poverty and suffering. Naturally, the Nigerian people protested. One notable figure was Ken Saro-Wiwa, who led non-violent campaigns against Shell's exploitation, but Shell, allegedly with the help of the Nigerian military, cracked down hard. Ken Saro-Wiwa, a Ngoni leader and environmental activist, became the voice of the Niger Delta's suffering communities. Through his organization, the Movement for the Survival of the Ngoni People, MOSOP, he highlighted the environmental damage and human rights abuses perpetrated by Shell. Saro-Wiwa's activism gained international attention, embarrassing Shell and the Nigerian government. In response, the Nigerian government, allegedly supported by Shell, used brutal force to suppress the dissent. In 1995, Saro-Wiwa and 8 other activists were arrested on trump-up charges and executed after a sham trial.
Other parts of the world where they prospect for oil. The devastation of the Ogoni countryside, the complete destruction of the Ogoni ecosystem, the dehumanization of the Ogoni people, the denial to them of education and other health facilities and other social amenities, all these together have led the Ogoni down the way of extinction. I accuse the Nigerian government and the international, multinational companies which prospect for oil in Ogoni of genocide. I appeal to the international community, to the British government, the American government, the Japanese government, the countries of the European community who buy oil from Nigeria to come now to the aid of the Ogoni people and stop this genocide.
I said yesterday that I thought this was a fraudulent trial, a bad verdict, an unjust sentence, and it has now been followed by judicial murder.
These executions were a stark warning to anyone who dared to oppose Shell. The international outcry was significant, but it did little to change the dire situation on the ground. The message was clear: Shell's operation in Nigeria would continue, regardless of human costs. The environmental and economic devastation left deep scars on the Nigerian people. Families were torn apart by illness and poverty. Traditional ways of life were obliterated, with fishermen and farmers seeing their livelihoods destroyed by pollution. Children born in the Niger Delta grew up amidst environmental ruin. Schools struggled to operate in polluted areas, and healthcare facilities were overwhelmed by the surge in illnesses caused by pollution. The social fabric of communities frayed as economic hardships forced many to migrate in search of better opportunities. These communities were once self-sufficient, thriving off the natural resources of the land and water. Now they were left to grapple with the consequences of oil extraction, the traditional ways of life wiped out by the contamination of their environments. The impact of Shell's operation is felt across generations. Young people, who should have inherited a vibrant and sustainable ecosystem, instead face a future marred by environmental degradation and limited economic prospects. Global communities has begun to take notice. Activist groups, environmental organizations, and international bodies are calling for greater accountability. Documentaries, reports, and campaigns have shed light on Shell's operations and their impacts. However, awareness is just the first step. There's a pressing need for sustained action to ensure Shell is held accountable and that similar situations are prevented in the future. Activists around the world are joining forces to pressure Shell and other multinational corporations to adopt ethical practices and to compensate the communities they have harmed. In recent developments, Shell has announced plans to sell off its assets in Nigeria, attempting to wash its hands and the devastation it caused. However, Amnesty International is staunchly opposing this move, arguing that Shell must first pay for its environmental and human damages inflicted on the Nigerian people. This stance is crucial. Shell cannot simply walk away. They must be held accountable and compensate for the lives and ecosystems they have destroyed. The global community must come to apply pressure to ensure justice is served. Even though Nigeria's resources are being poisoned by the day, with the population becoming more and more impoverished, the Western media praises Shell for their progressivism, helping the environment and stopping climate change. The story of Shell is one of environmental destruction, human suffering, and corporate greed. Shell's actions in Nigeria serve as a grim reminder of the consequences when profit is prioritized over people and the planet.